Before you read this, you need to understand something about the lies we tell ourselves. We build them, brick by brick, out of our fear and our pride. We tell ourselves we are strong for enduring the thing we hate. We tell ourselves we are brave for accepting our fate. We tell ourselves that the misery we know is better than the terrifying unknown. But what if the unknown isn't a monster? What if it's just a man who smells of pine and wood smoke, with hands that know the weight of an axe and the gentleness of a newborn calf? What if the person you were forced to marry is the one person who can see the ghost of the girl you used to be? This story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound salvation is found in the place you were most terrified to look. It's about how the human heart can learn to beat again, not in spite of its scars, but because of them. This is a story of how a life sentence of misery became, instead, a pardon. The scent of sagebrush and fear was the first thing I remember. It clung to everything: my dress, my skin, the very air I dragged into my lungs. A sour, desperate smell, thick as the dust that swirled around the wheels of the wagon. I was a parcel, wrapped in a brown wool dress, being delivered to a new life. A life I was certain would be a living death. My name is Clara, and at 23 I had been sentenced to life on a mountain. My crime: being the daughter of a man with too much debt and a stepmother with too little heart. My father, a man whose love for a good card game outweighed his love for his only child, had lost everything in a poker game to a man named Silas, a grizzled rancher who lived somewhere up in the wild, God-forsaken mountains that clawed at the horizon. He couldn't pay his debt in coin, so he paid with his daughter. My stepmother, Margaret, had packed my single, worn-out trunk with a practiced smile. "A fine match, Clara," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "He's a man of property. You'll be a lady of the mountains." She had looked at me as if I were a recalcitrant cow being sold to a new rancher. I was trade goods, a piece of livestock to settle a debt, and the man who would own me was a stranger. The wagon lurched and groaned as it climbed a steeper section of the trail. I gripped the wooden side, my knuckles white. The driver, a taciturn man named Ezra who was Silas's hired hand, hadn't spoken a word to me since we left the town of Pine Hollow 3 days ago. He just chewed on a piece of straw and spat, his eyes fixed on the rutted path ahead. The world grew wilder and more intimidating with every passing mile. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, which in turn surrendered to towering, jagged peaks. Ponderosa pines, ancient and tall, stood sentinel over the trail, their branches whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. The air grew thin and cold, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the town below. I had escaped one kind of prison, my stepmother's cruel words, my father's neglect, only to be delivered to a more terrifying one. I pictured my new husband as a brute, a man whose hands were scarred from years of violent work, a man with a heart as cold and hard as the granite he lived upon. I'd heard stories, the kind whispered in dark corners, about men who took wives from the settlements and how they treated them. They were little more than slaves, worked to the bone and discarded when they were no longer useful. My fate, I was certain, was sealed. The trail eventually broadened, leading to a sprawling ranch. It wasn't the monstrous, terrifying fortress I had imagined. It was humble, built of weathered logs. A large barn and a few outbuildings clustered around it, all set against a breathtaking backdrop of a forested mountain. It was unexpectedly beautiful. The scent of wood smoke and pine was more prominent here, mixing with the earthy smell of horse and hay. But the beauty of the place did nothing to soothe my terror. It felt like a gilded cage. Ezra pulled the wagon to a stop, and for a long moment there was silence. Then the door to the cabin opened and a man stepped out. I had braced myself for a monster. I was not prepared for what I saw. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was peppered with gray at the temples and a beard that was neatly trimmed. He wore simple work clothes, a faded blue shirt and dark pants, and his face was lined with deep creases, not from cruelty but from years of squinting into the sun and snow. It was a strong, weathered face, but his eyes, a pale, startling gray, were what held me captive. They weren't cold but watchful. He looked at me the way one might examine a skittish animal, with a quiet, patient wariness. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate from deep within his chest. It wasn't a question. "I'm Silas." My voice was a dry rasp in my throat. I couldn't speak. I just stared at him. He didn't move to help me down from the wagon. He just waited. His eyes scanned me briefly, taking in my worn dress, the few strands of hair that had escaped my severe bun, and the small, pathetic trunk that held the sum total of my life. He didn't look disgusted or triumphant. If I had to put a name to his expression, it was tired, a bone-deep weariness that I recognized in myself. It was the first thing I saw, and it was the only thing that stopped me from collapsing into a puddle of fear. A small, grubby face appeared at the cabin window. It was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with a riot of dark curls and eyes that were a bright, curious blue. She was quick as a flash, and in the next instant she was outside, hiding behind Silas's leg. He placed a large, work-worn hand on her head, a gesture of such casual affection that it caught me off guard. "This is Rosie," he said, his gaze flicking to the girl then back to me. "You'll be taking care of her now." So I was a housekeeper and a nursemaid. I was prepared for that. I was prepared for the hard work, the isolation, and the loneliness. But I was not prepared for the confusion. There was no malice in his voice, no gloating. There was just this simple, tired statement of fact. He expected me to work, to care for the child, to be a part of this household. He helped me down from the wagon then, his grip on my waist firm and sure. He was surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. He didn't linger. As soon as my feet were on the ground, he stepped back, leaving a space between us that felt almost deliberate. Inside the cabin was a revelation. It wasn't the hovel I had anticipated. The single room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, where a fire crackled and popped cheerfully. The floor was polished wood, covered in woven rag rugs. A sturdy table and chairs sat in the center, and a loft above held a straw mattress and rough-hewn quilts. There was a simple rocking chair near the fire and an old clock ticking softly on the mantel. The air smelled of stew and baking bread. There was a stack of books on a shelf, not a Bible, but a collection of poetry and historical tales. He was a man who could read and cook. The gilded cage suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a strange, unsettling paradox. How could a man be so resourceful, so gentle, and still be the monster who had agreed to buy a woman? The next few weeks were a blur of physical exhaustion and emotional turmoil. Silas was a man of few words. He communicated through grunts and short commands, but his eyes were always watching. He had a way of seeing me, not just looking at me. He saw the exhaustion, the fear I tried so hard to hide. He saw the flinch when he moved too quickly, and he always gave me space. His little girl, Rosie, was a sunbeam in the gloom. She was relentlessly cheerful and inquisitive. Her mother had died 2 years prior, Silas had told me one night when I was brave enough to ask. He didn't elaborate and I didn't press. He took a long, slow drink of his coffee, his gaze on the fire. The grief was a tangible presence in the room, a ghost that lived in the corners of the cabin. Rosie, however, was made of different stuff. She was a whirlwind of energy, her little hands sticky with honey, her shoes leaving a trail of dirt across the floor. She was eager to help, to please, to fill the silent spaces with her chatter. She would tell me about the birds in the yard and the calves in the barn and the secret hiding spot she'd made in the forest. She saw me not as a stranger, but as a new friend, a potential playmate, a storyteller. Her trust was a burden and a gift. Silas would often watch us from the corner of his eye as I helped Rosie with her chores, as I taught her the rudiments of cooking, as I sewed a patch on her worn dress. He never interfered, but I felt the weight of his observation. It wasn't a threat, but it was a constant pressure. One afternoon, as I was struggling to carry a heavy bucket of water from the well, he appeared beside me without a sound. His hand closed over the handle. "Let me," was all he said. I was so startled I stumbled back. He took the bucket, hauled it into the house, and set it down without a word. Then he was gone again, back to his workshop, leaving me breathless and confused. Another evening, a week later, I had managed to burn the beans I was cooking for supper. I stood over the pot, staring at the blackened, acrid mess, tears welling in my eyes. It was a small thing, but it felt like the final, pathetic evidence of my failure. He wouldn't accept a wife who couldn't even cook a simple meal. He walked in, sniffed the air, and his face gave away nothing. He walked to the pot, examined the ruined food, and then, to my utter shock, he smiled. It was a small, wry smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. "That'll put hair on a man's chest," he drawled. "Don't fret, I'll have the stew from yesterday." It was the first time he had said something that wasn't a command or a monosyllabic reply, and in that moment I saw a flash of something else in his eyes. Not pity, not triumph. It was understanding. He had burned beans before. He knew what it was to fail at something as simple as feeding himself. I started to see him differently after that. I saw him as a man who had been alone for a long time, a man who had lost his wife and was now trying to raise a daughter on his own, a man who was struggling, just like me, to make a life in this beautiful, cruel wilderness. He wasn't a monster. He was just another lost soul trying to find his way in the dark, and the dark was something I knew all too well. It was the first crack in the armor of my hatred, a tiny fissure that let a sliver of something unexpected in. Winter came to the mountain with a vengeance. It didn't tiptoe in, announcing its arrival with a dusting of snow. It descended like an avalanche, blanketing the world in a suffocating white. The wind howled down the valley, a mournful banshee that rattled the cabin windows and sent icy drafts through every crack and crevice. The world we had known, of golden sunsets and clear mountain air, was erased, replaced by a monochromatic landscape of endless white. We were isolated, cut off from the world below by drifts that were taller than a man. And it was in that frozen silence, trapped together in the small cabin, that the true bond began to form. The constant struggle for survival stripped away the pretense. There was no room for formalities when your fingers were numb with cold and the woodpile was shrinking faster than expected. We fell into a rhythm, a silent understanding of shared labor and shared necessity. Silas would chop wood, his axe a rhythmic, percussive heartbeat against the muffled silence of the snow. I would tend to the fire, coaxing it back to life each morning from the embers of the night before. Rosie became our little helper, fetching kindling and setting the table with a newfound sense of purpose. It was in the quiet moments, however, that the real understanding grew. The evenings were the most difficult. After supper, we would sit by the fire, the only light in the world coming from the flames. Silas would whittle, his large hands creating small shapes out of pine, a bird, a horse, a tiny, perfect heart. I would read to Rosie by the firelight, my voice a soft counterpoint to the crackling fire. The books Silas had were full of adventure and poetry. He would listen from his corner, never interrupting, just absorbing the words. He began to talk more. It started with little things, quiet observations about the weather, the behavior of the livestock, the tracks he'd seen in the snow. He told me stories about the mountain, about his first winter here, about the animals he'd known. He spoke of the grizzly bear that had raided his root cellar, the wily fox that stole his hens, and the family of wolves whose howls would pierce the night. He spoke of them with a respect I didn't expect, as if they were neighbors, not threats. One night he spoke of his wife, Mary. It was a random thing, a story triggered by the fire. He said she loved the fire. She'd say it was like a window to another world, a world of warmth and light. She used to tell Rosie stories about the spirits that lived in the flames. There was a deep, aching sorrow in his voice, but it was not a forbidden subject. It was a treasured memory he was sharing with me. He didn't look at me while he spoke, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. It was as if he was talking to himself, and I was simply lucky enough to overhear. I didn't say anything. I just let his words hang in the air, like the smoke from the fire. Slowly, his story began to bleed into my own. I found myself telling him about my mother who had died when I was young. I told him about the happy times before the darkness, before my father's gambling and my stepmother's cruelty. I told him about the pretty dresses I used to wear, the stories my mother used to tell me, the smell of her lavender perfume. It felt strange to speak these things aloud, like I was giving them back to the world. He listened in the same way he always did, his presence a steady anchor in the howling storm. Christmas came, a day that was both joyous and melancholy. Rosie was beside herself with excitement, having discovered the stockings we had hung by the fireplace. Inside them, Silas had put small treasures, a new ribbon for Rosie, a small tin of peppermints for me. In mine there was also a small wooden bird, a perfect replica of the ones that had perched on the eaves of the cabin. He had carved it himself. A simple gift, but it was a gift and it was given with care. I felt a lump in my throat. It was the first time in years someone had thought to give me something just because. New Year's Eve was spent in quiet reflection. The snow was still falling and the cabin felt like a ship alone on a white, endless sea. Rosie had fallen asleep early, exhausted from the day's excitement. Silas and I sat by the fire. He was whittling and I was mending a tear in one of his shirts. The silence was comfortable, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally he spoke, his voice low and gruff. "You're not what I expected, Clara." I looked up startled. "What did you expect?" "I don't rightly know," he said, his eyes still fixed on his work. "Someone broken, someone angry." He paused, setting down his knife. He looked at me then, his gray eyes clear and intense. "But you're not broken, you're just waiting, like a wild thing that's been caged, waiting to see if the cage is gonna open or not." I felt a sharp sting of recognition. He had seen through me, seen the constant vigilance, the fear that was always coiled in my gut. I had been biding my time, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the cruelty to begin. It hadn't. "I don't understand you, Silas," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. "You could have any woman you wanted from the settlement. Why did you agree to take me?" A shadow crossed his face. He looked away, back at the fire. "I didn't take you, Clara. I paid a debt, a large one for something I didn't ask for." He let out a long, slow breath. "I needed a mother for Rosie, someone to take care of the house, a wife, that's all. I didn't want to go and court some woman I didn't know. You just—" He shrugged his broad shoulders. "You just appeared. It was easier." Easier? The word stung, but there was no malice in it. Just a stark, painful truth. He turned to me, his expression softening. "But you're more than just an answer to a problem, Clara. I see you. I see how you are with Rosie. I see your kindness. I see your strength. You're a fighter. I just don't think you know it yet." He didn't touch me. He didn't reach out. He just gave me his words, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. It was the most intimate moment I had ever experienced, more so than any stolen kiss. It was a moment of soul baring, of seeing and being seen. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my loft, listening to the wind and the creak of the logs, his words echoing in my head. "You're a fighter. I just don't think you know it yet." It was a revelation. All my life I had been told I was a burden, a commodity, a piece of property. No one had ever told me I was strong. I felt a shift inside me, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. It was a fragile, terrifying emotion, but it was real. A week later, the thaw began. The snow started to melt, and the world revealed itself once more. The first day I was able to step outside without wading through waist-deep snow felt like a rebirth. The sun was warm on my face, the air was fresh, and the world was waking up. I walked down to the edge of the property, and I was overcome by the sheer, overwhelming beauty of it all. I felt a reckless urge, a desire to feel something alive. Without a second thought, I took off my shoes and my socks. I stood there, my bare feet in the cold, muddy spring earth, and I laughed. He found me there, my skirt hitched up, shivering and laughing with mud squelching between my toes. He just stood there, watching with a strange, soft look on his face. "What are you doing?" he asked, a hint of a smile in his voice. "I'm feeling," I said, breathless. "I'm feeling alive." He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on my face. I saw it then, a new kind of warmth in his gaze. It wasn't the warmth of pity or friendship. It was something else, something deeper, something that made my heart flutter. It was a new and terrifying possibility. but for the first time I didn't want to run away. That spring brought more than just the thaw. It brought a thaw in the ice that had formed around my own heart. I began to see the mountain, not as a prison, but as a home. I began to see Silas, not as a captor, but as a man. And the most terrifying realization of all was that I had begun to see myself as a woman who could have a future here. Our relationship changed. The unspoken bond was now a tangible, delicate thing. It was in the way his hand would brush against mine when passing the salt. It was in the way he would hold my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. It was in the quiet pride in his eyes when I mastered a new skill, like baking bread that didn't resemble a hockey puck, or helping to bring a struggling calf into the world. It was in those moments that I could feel a deep well of emotion opening up inside me, a fear mingled with an impossible, burgeoning love. The world seemed to be blooming around us. The wildflowers were a riot of color on the mountain slopes, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and blooming clover. We would take walks together, the three of us, after the evening chores were done. Silas would hold my hand, his touch tentative at first, then growing bolder. It was a small, simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Then the letter arrived. It was a hot, dusty afternoon in late spring. I was in the garden pulling weeds when I saw a rider approaching. He wasn't one of our neighbors, he was a stranger. He handed a folded paper to Silas, who was in the yard. As he read it, his face grew pale. He crushed the paper in his fist and looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He told me the news, his voice flat. "There's trouble in the valley. The army is rounding up the scattered Apache bands. It's causing a lot of unrest. Some of them are coming up into these hills. The man said they've been raiding isolated homesteads." He looked at me and then at Rosie, who was playing by the well. "We're not safe here, Clara. We have to go down to the settlement." But there was a problem. It was too late. That very night a fire was spotted on a neighboring ranch, a high orange glow that painted the sky. The next day Silas rode out to check on a neighbor and returned with a grim face. The neighbor's family had fled, but the house was burned to the ground. He had seen tracks. The Apache were close, very close. The fear I had felt on that first day in the wagon returned, magnified 1,000-fold. This wasn't the abstract fear of a cruel husband. This was the cold, primal terror of a predator. We were trapped. Silas refused to run. "There's no point," he had said. "We'd be caught out in the open. The cabin is defensible. We hold out here." The next few days were a nightmare of silent waiting. Silas had boarded up the windows and reinforced the door. He had his rifle and old sharps always within reach. I was terrified. I jumped at every sound, the snap of a twig, the cry of a bird. Rosie was terrified, and my heart ached for her. I could see the ghost of her mother's death in the way she clung to me. Silas was a rock, an immovable presence in the center of our storm. He barely slept, his gray eyes scanning the tree line. He had become the protector, the guardian. And I, the frightened girl who had been delivered as payment, was terrified for him, for Rosie, for all of us. I would watch him, and I would see the resolve in his jaw, the way he would check his rifle. He was not a man who would give up without a fight. He was a man who would burn the world down to protect his family. And in that moment, I knew that I was part of that family. The attack came on the third night. The first sign was the distant, unearthly howl, not of a wolf, but of a man, a war cry that sliced through the night. Silas was on his feet in an instant, pulling me and Rosie behind him. The cabin shook as a volley of arrows thudded into the walls, and then the brutal, percussive crack of gunfire answered them. Silas's rifle roared. The next hours were a blur of unbearable noise and terror. He fought like a demon, moving from one loophole to the next, firing, reloading, firing again. I huddled in a corner with Rosie, my arms wrapped around her, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And then I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, a sharp cry of pain from Silas. He had stumbled back from the window, clutching his shoulder. Blood, dark and thick, was seeping through his fingers. He was hit. The assailants saw their advantage and pressed their attack, their cries growing louder. Silas looked at me, his face pale with pain. "Clara," he rasped, "take Rosie to the root cellar. Bar the door from the inside. Don't come out for anything, you understand?" "No, Silas," I cried. "I won't leave you." He gripped my wrist with his good hand. "You have to, for Rosie, please." The word please was what broke me. It was a plea, a raw, desperate plea from a man who was willing to die for his family. He pushed me away and took up his position by the window again. I saw the fear in his eyes, the pain in his shoulder, but I also saw the love. He wasn't just fighting to protect his daughter, he was fighting to protect me. He was my husband. In that moment, the fear inside me transformed. It hardened into a cold, sharp resolve. I was no longer just a fragile girl. I was a protector, too. I looked at the burning cabin, the broken window, my wounded husband, and I knew what I had to do. I pushed Rosie behind the heavy oak table. "Stay here, Rosie, and don't move." Then I grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. It was a ridiculous weapon, a domestic implement turned into a last-ditch defense. It was all I had. I crept toward the back door. I didn't know what I was going to do. I only knew that I couldn't cower in a corner while my family was being destroyed. The door burst open. A dark figure loomed in the doorway, a knife gleaming in his hand. My life had been built on a series of cowardly acts, accepting my fate, running from my past, hiding in a frightened silence. In that moment I shed that old skin. I didn't think. I just acted. I swung the heavy skillet with all the force I could muster. It connected with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the floor. It was the first time I had ever fought back. It was the most terrifying and the most liberating thing I had ever done. Silas was still at the window, his rifle hot in his hands. His face was white, but his eyes were locked on the doorway. He saw the man fall and he looked at me. There was no judgment in his eyes. There was only a fierce, overwhelming pride. In that moment I wasn't just his wife. I was his partner. I was a survivor, and I was a fighter. The attackers, demoralized and having lost a man, melted back into the night. The sounds of the attack faded, leaving behind a ringing silence and the acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke. The battle was over, but the war for our lives and our hearts had only just begun. We had survived, but the cost was high. We were scarred, we were changed, and we were bound together in a way that went far beyond a debt. We were bound by blood, by fire, and by a love that had been forged in the crucible of terror. The morning after the attack was a strange, surreal dawn. The world was the same as it had always been, the sun rising golden over the mountain peaks, the birds singing their morning songs, but everything had changed. The cabin was a wreck. Arrow holes peppered the walls like a pox, and the smell of smoke and blood was thick in the air. But we were alive, all three of us. Silas was pale and weak from the wound in his shoulder. I had done my best to dress it, using strips of clean linen and a poultice of herbs I'd seen him use on the horses. He looked at me with a new kind of respect. "You were brave, Clara," he said, his voice rough and low. "Braver than any man I've ever known." I shook my head. "I was just scared," I whispered. "I couldn't let you die. I couldn't let Rosie." "You didn't," he said firmly. "You fought. You saved us." He reached out with his good hand and placed it over mine. His skin was warm, his touch gentle. "You're not the woman who arrived on that wagon anymore." He was right. I wasn't. The woman who had arrived on that wagon had been a victim, a frightened child. The woman who stood in that ruined cabin was a survivor. She had seen the face of violence and had not flinched. She had been forged in fire, and the flame had made her stronger. But the victory felt hollow. I had killed a man. It had been necessary, but the memory of the sickening crack of the skillet, the feeling of his body giving way, would haunt me forever. I had been so certain that my life was over, that I was destined for a lifetime of suffering. I had been wrong. Now I was certain of something else entirely, that I had found a home, a family, a love I didn't know I was capable of. And the terror of that love was almost as great as the terror of the attack. The days that followed were a slow, painful recovery. Silas was bedridden for a week, the wound in his shoulder taking its time to heal. The responsibility of running the ranch fell entirely on me. It was a heavy burden, but I was determined not to let him down. I learned to feed the livestock, to milk the cow, to chop the wood. I did it all with a grim determination, a fierce need to prove myself worthy of the life I had been given. Rosie was my constant shadow. The attack had bonded us in a way that was unshakable. She was no longer just the child I was responsible for, she was my daughter. I had held her in the dark, I had protected her with my life, and she had clung to me as if I were the only anchor in a storm. That kind of trust is not given freely, it is earned, and I had earned it. Silas would watch me from his cot, his eyes full of a quiet wonder. One evening when the chores were done and Rosie was asleep, he beckoned me to his side. His voice was weak, but he was trying to sit up. "Clara," he said softly, "come here." I moved to the edge of his cot and he reached for my hand. He pulled me down to sit beside him. He looked at me, his eyes glistening. "I saw you," he said, "in the firelight, the way you fought, the way you held yourself. I saw you, Clara. For the first time I truly saw you." He pushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his calloused fingers grazing my cheek. "You asked me once why I married you," he said. "I told you it was because it was easier. That was a lie. I told myself it was true, but it wasn't. I saw you in that wagon and I knew you were the one who could fill the hole in my heart, the one who could be a mother to Rosie, the one who could be my wife. I saw your fear, but I also saw your strength. I just didn't know how to tell you." His words washed over me like a warm wave. Everything I had felt, all the confusion and fear and burgeoning love, it all made sense. He hadn't seen me as a burden. He had seen me as a possibility. He had seen the woman I could become, even when I couldn't see her myself. "And now," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Now," he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand, "now I'm just a man who's grateful that you came into my life, grateful that you chose to stay, grateful that you saved my daughter." He leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine. It was a simple, tender gesture. He was in pain, but he was also happy. His breath was warm on my face. "You're not just my wife, Clara," he murmured. "You're my partner, my equal, my home. I love you." The words, spoken so simply, broke the last of the dam holding back my own feelings. I began to cry. For the first time in my life, it was not a cry of sorrow or fear. It was a cry of relief, a cry of joy, a cry of love. "I love you too, Silas," I said, my voice choked. "I love you and I love Rosie. I love this life. I don't want to leave. I never want to leave." He pulled me into his arms, and the embrace was the most beautiful thing I had ever known. It was a promise of a future, a promise of a family, a promise of peace. After the attack, we never spoke of it again. It was a shared trauma that was too heavy to unpack. The memories lingered, of course, they always would. They were a part of the story of who we had become. The attack had almost destroyed us, but it had also sealed our fate. It had driven the final nail into the coffin of my old life and forced me to embrace the new one. It had forced me to be strong. And it had given me something I never thought I would have, a family. Over the months that followed, the scars of the attack began to fade. The cabin was repaired, the crops grew, the livestock thrived, but the most profound change was in the three of us. We had weathered the storm together. We had emerged on the other side, bruised and battered but whole. We had become a family not by blood but by choice, by love, by fire. I found myself laughing more, dreaming more. I would often walk down to the creek just to sit on the bank and watch the water flow. I was free. I was a prisoner no more. I was a wife. I was a mother. I was a partner. I was a survivor. One evening, as the sun was setting over the mountain, I was on the porch sewing. Rosie was playing with a rag doll at my feet. Silas came and sat in the chair beside me. He didn't speak, just put his hand on my knee and squeezed it. It was a gesture of pure affection, a simple, everyday love. He put his hand on my knee and his thumb traced a small, lazy circle on the worn fabric of my dress. The world was quiet and I was content. He looked over at me, his eyes finally free of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. He was a mountain man born of the land, strong and stubborn. But he was also a man who had learned to love again, and he had taught me to do the same. I had come here a frightened girl, sold like a possession to a life I thought would be pure suffering. But Silas, with his quiet strength and his stubborn love, had other plans, and I was finally grateful for them, for him, for my life. The story of Silas and Clara ends there, in a quiet moment on a mountain porch as the sun dips below the peaks. It's not a grand, sweeping epic. It's a simple story of two broken souls who found each other in the most unlikely of places. A story of survival and sacrifice. A story of resilience. A story of how a girl, traded like a commodity, found her own way to be free. It's a story about how the person you fear the most can sometimes be the one who saves you. It's a story about how love can bloom in the most barren of soils. And it's a story of how, sometimes, the very life you thought would be your undoing can, in the end, be the only thing that can make you whole. A story of finding a home, finding a family, and finding a love worth fighting for. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the pines. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace that I had never known. I was home. I was where I belonged. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.